My whole mission was this dichotomy of the mundane and the sublime. So I'd be like, work, and then take a second, and you'd see a view that humans weren't meant to see that is just, you can't even imagine. And I saw the sunrise, and my first overwhelming impression was I'd never seen that shade of blue before. It was just beautiful. There's not even a word to describe it. And it was like I'm seeing God out here in space. That kind of puts the mundane in perspective. Half of my training was in Russia. Half of my crew were Russian cosmonauts. And I just got to be great friends with them. While I was training, the Ukraine Civil War happened. So I'm in space with all this stuff going on. And in space, we watched little red flashes, and with my cosmonauts, we could see bombs going off in Ukraine. When you're here, born and raised on Earth, this is home, and everything else is out there. But when you're out there, you get to see Earth as a spaceship flying through the universe. We need to be crewmates, not just passengers.
This week on the show, we welcome the NASA astronaut, U.S. Air Force Colonel, and Space Station Commander Terry Virts. He spent over 200 days in space, the third longest consecutive mission, and he at the same time took over 320,000 pictures from space. He also filmed footage that is now the IMAX movie, A Beautiful Planet, narrated by Jennifer Lawrence. And it's funny, Terry was actually in our studio and he was pointing out the footage that he filmed in space on his GoPro camera on a spacewalk. And me and the video guys were like, what? And he's like, yeah, I filmed that on a GoPro and I filmed that here. And he is really passionate about the way the Earth looks when he's up in space. And of course, he's the consummate astronaut. He had amazing stories about what it was like to be up there with the Russians, why the Ukrainian crisis was kicking off, and how the Russian people were really professional when it came to their space program and didn't let politics get in the way. And now Terry is off to write a book, become a speaker, and find his career after being an astronaut. But his big message is, don't tell yourself no. And so many times in his career, he went for it. He took a chance while many of the people in his classes decided that they didn't want to do that. And that's why he became an astronaut, and a lot of them just stayed test pilots and stayed in the Air Force. So a lot of great lessons from Terry. He's such a humble and normal dude, and yet he's been up in space multiple times. So it's an amazing episode, and you got a ton to learn from Terry. And we've got a ton to teach you. The London Real Academy is kicking off, and we listened. A lot of you said, Brian, I want to know, tell me about your movement practice. Tell me about your spiritual practice, about your affirmations, about your meditations, about how you eat, about how you stay fit and healthy. So we put it all together in a lifestyle accelerator program, which is starting January 1st. Super excited to have you involved. So keep an eye for your emails. We'll be sending out notifications soon. And hopefully you can join me for 6 weeks and we can kick off 2017 with a bang and get all of our lives back in order. And now I leave you with the astronaut, Mr. Terry Virts. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Terry Virts, the U.S. Air Force Colonel, NASA astronaut, and space station commander. You have flown on the space shuttle, conducted 3 spacewalks, and logged 200 consecutive days on the International Space Station. You've recently starred in a new IMAX film, A Beautiful Planet, narrated by Jennifer Lawrence, that chronicles the natural wonders of Earth captured from space. Terry, welcome to London Real.
It's great to be here.
Awesome to have you here. I'm always curious. You flew here from Texas. When you think of London and England and you're flying in here, what is your impression of like this country, this town, these people as a culture?
Oh man, I love England. It's beautiful. The main thing about England that scares me is that driving on the left-hand side of the road, because I'm always afraid I'm going to get run over. So it's like you got to look both ways before crossing the street. But it's a beautiful country, and love the history, and it's awesome to be here.
Yeah, it's got this whole history of kind of exploration,
yes,
right? And kind of, I guess, sea navigation, which, you know, I guess probably has some thoughts and parallels to, you know, air and space navigation.
It does. Yeah, I think the tradition of exploration, it was pretty much found and born here, right here in the UK. And, you know, for centuries, England set the standard for exploring space or exploring the Earth. And even now, recently, they're back into space because Tim Peake, a British-born astronaut, just landed from his space station flight. And when I flew on my space shuttle flight a few years ago, I flew with Nick Patrick, who's a British-born person, now American citizen. But I got some great time, you know, flying with Brits in space. And so it's a pretty cool history tradition.
Yeah, it's fascinating because if you think it's some of these guys that went out on these ships back in the day, you know, to try to, you know, circumnavigate the globe or go to these crazy places. I mean, they really didn't know what was out there.
I know. Well, it's amazing, you know, flying across the Pacific Ocean in space happens pretty quick, but man, that is a gigantic ocean. And you look down and there's from space and there's nothing but water in all directions. And I would often think about what was it like to be on a ship where you didn't know, you're just going on a parallel and, you know, you run into Australia, Captain Cook or those guys. So I would think about them from the you know, 22-degree comfort of my space station and think, man, those are some pretty brave guys to do that.
Right. And when you were in the Air Force, I mean, you know, test piloting was still happening as well. And like we all know that great movie, The Right Stuff, which is the only thing I think about when I think of test pilots. I think of these guys that are going up, as they would say, pushing the envelope, right? Pushing the outside of the envelope.
Right.
And they're doing their own bit of exploration, you know, doing things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also giving us intellectual property that we can build on. Like what happens when you go to the speed of sound, or twice the speed of sound.
Right.
When you were flying, you know, what was that whole mentality like?
Yeah, the test pilot is, you know, seeing what you can do. And actually that movie is so awesome. George Zambo, who's my space shuttle commander, and I watched that movie the night before our space shuttle launch. Like we went down, sat in the lounge, put the right stuff on and watched it. And then the next day we went out and flew into space on a space shuttle, which was pretty cool.
Is that the right movie to watch before you go into space?
It was good. On my most recent flight on the station, we actually watched Gravity while we were in space.
While you were in space?
Yeah, so we got a chuckle out of that. Everybody's like, you watched Gravity while you were in space? But it was funny.
What is the thing that you laugh the most at when you see Gravity?
You know, Gravity, the thing that we laughed the most, so I flew with an Italian lady named Samantha Cristoforetti. So we always talk about who they chose to play us, you know, George Clooney and Sandra Bullock. So we laugh about that.
So you're George Clooney, okay.
Yeah.
And like certain things were you...
Unfortunately, he didn't survive. So, but anyway, yeah.
But certain things, were you impressed with the reality of the way they depicted it? And is certain things just a Hollywood version of what it's like?
Well, yeah. So it's basically an animated movie. But the animation is very realistic. What the space station looks like, or what the space shuttle looks like, they got that really close. The physics of what was happening, you know, they had to take some liberties of changing orbits and that kind of stuff. But that's okay. You gotta make the movie interesting for people. The thing I did not like about the movie was the point of the movie was just get back to Earth because it's safe. Like, don't be in space. So I didn't like that. I'm more of a let's go into space and explore. But yeah, the animation and stuff was very accurate. Taking a fire extinguisher and changing orbits from Hubble to space station can't be done, but that's okay.
Okay.
It was a good movie.
Too far
Yeah.
far away.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess there was that subtle underlying thing of is that Earth is safe, not space.
That was what I didn't like about
Okay.
it. Yeah.
Which you don't feel that way.
Well, safe space is certainly dangerous. I mean, it requires a lot of effort to do it, but America wasn't safe either for 4 or 5 centuries of Christopher Columbus and when the Brits first went there to Jamestown, I think 90% of the colony died. So, exploration involves risk, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Right. Just going back to The Right Stuff briefly, like when you watch that movie, does that bring back memories of flight school? Do you know guys that are like that? And how accurate was that movie?
I think it was completely accurate. Now, life in the 50s and 60s is different than, life in the 90s and 2000s. The politically correct aspect was different, and we weren't developing a new fighter jet every year or two. Nowadays, the airplanes take decades and billions of dollars. But the whole concept of you're going to go do something that hasn't been done, or we're still doing that. I mean, even today, with new airplanes or new bombs or missiles or whatever you're testing on a fighter is still there. And you remember the medical scene of they were getting tested to be astronauts?
Yeah.
It's still like that. I mean, they don't stick a needle in your hand anymore and do that, but a lot of that stuff was just what it was for me when I applied to be an astronaut. So those scenes bring back memories too.
Where you're carrying around the bottle of water,
Yes.
or whatever was going on.
Yep.
There's that whole dichotomy of these test pilots and then astronauts in that movie, where here you got guys that are a bit crazy to go do these things, but also you've got guys that are very systematic and quite safe, as in they do things in a calculated way, but then at the end of the day, they're going up where they might not come back.
Right.
And does that classify what an astronaut is or a test pilot?
Yeah, we're kind of crazy. So you have to have a safety mentality. So NASA just got 18,000 applications for the new astronaut class. So we don't want just thrill seekers, right? We want people who are able to operate under pressure, but we don't want just risk for risk's sake. So you have to have a blend of you're willing to do some crazy things, but you handle it in a professional, calculated risk kind of way. So when you fly into space, you know that there's a danger that the rocket might blow up, but the capsule has an escape system, or in the space shuttle we had a parachute that could potentially have been used. So it's you recognize the risks that you have, and then you take them actively. It's funny, like a lot of times when I'll drive the speed limit. And I'm like, that guy, and my friends will say, dude, you're an astronaut. Well, you should be driving crazy and stuff. I'm like, well, if I had to, I would, but you kind of have to balance the risks that you take. And so that is an interesting dichotomy.
Do most astronauts drive the speed limit? Probably.
It probably depends.
Okay. There's a few outliers.
There's a few outliers, yeah, just like anything.
There's something that I've heard called the overview effect, and I don't know if you've heard of this theory, that people like yourselves that have spent so much time watching the Earth rotate, and I mean, you took 320,000 pictures, and you were just talking about it in the studio to all of our guys here, and you're obviously passionate about viewing the Earth and taking pictures in the light and in the day and just seeing the majesty of this planet.
Right.
Do you think that kind of gets into your head, and to where you see the Earth, the population, the species kind of in a different way? And when you come back, it's like, do you feel like it's changed you as a person?
So it has. There's a couple of great effects from that, the overview effect. My crewmate Samantha put it this way, that you get to see Earth as a spaceship flying through the universe. It's like when you're here, born and raised on Earth, this is home, and everything else is out there. But when you're out there, you can look back and see that the Earth is a spaceship. And the words that she used are, we need to be crewmates, not just passengers, which I think is a great description of it. But the other thing, it's so easy to get bogged down in daily stress, and I got emails and there's traffic and blah, blah, blah. And I can just like close my eyes and realize that there's the most unbelievable sunset that you can't even imagine happening right now, just right on the other side of the Earth. And this amazing Milky Way is out there. And so that kind of puts the mundane in perspective, which is a really great. not to say that, things are meaningless here or we're just a speck in the giant universe, but to say that there really is a bigger picture, more meaningful things, and not to get too stressed out about the daily life. When I landed for my first space flight, I landed, got reunited with my family, did medical tests, and I went back to my room, and I was like alone. And so just like any business traveler, you go to your room, you turn on TV. So I turned on the TV, and I just landed on the space shuttle a couple hours ago. CNN was on, and I watched it for like 30 seconds. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. This is news. It was complete meaningless, blah, blah, blah. And that was my one moment where I went, all this stuff is really meaningless. Some things are meaningful, but most stuff isn't that we worry about on Earth. Because I'm like, I was just flying through the atmosphere, and the perspective really is, I think, a great thing, a great change for me anyway.
And you mentioned like we're actually crew members on our own spaceship.
Right.
And so besides the news being quite meaningless sometimes, also, do you see like sometimes conflict? You come back and like, here we are all on this beautiful spaceship,
right?
And yet we all seem to want to pick all these fights with each other and put each other in these different teams. Does that also become something irritating when you get back?
So it's the International Space Station, and the main partners are Russia and the US. There's also Europe and Japan and Canada. And so half of my training was in Russia. Half of my crew were Russian cosmonauts. And I just got to be great friends with them. I love being there with the Russian people. The night before launch, I was with Samantha and Anton, and I said, I'm an only child. And we did our toast, and I said, you guys are like my brother and sister, even though I'm an only child. So while I was training, the Ukraine Civil War happened, and Russia annexed Crimea, and we, the West and Europe and America, imposed sanctions on Russia. So I'm in space with all this stuff going on.
In space while that's happening, okay.
In training and in space.
So in training.
It was that time. It was 2013, 2014, 2015. Right. That's when all that stuff happened.
So you're in Star City while it's happening on the ground, training, and then up there, okay.
And in space, we watched little red flashes, and with my cosmonauts, we could see bombs going off in Ukraine.
Seriously.
And if you're Russian, you have a cousin or a mother or yourself or somebody's from Ukraine. It's like England and Wales or something.
Yeah, it's a huge population center. Yeah.
They're cousins, or closer. So we were watching the war happen there, and my Anton is from Sevastopol, which became Russia. And they were on the phone calling home, hey, how's our apartment doing? Or because their currency got cut in half because of the sanctions. So anyway, I was right in the middle of this conflict. And here we are getting along great. And we're, friends and eating dinner together. We're like surviving space together, which is not an easy thing because you could die pretty quickly in outer space. So I've seen that dichotomy of, on the interpersonal level, people are people and you can get along very well. Whereas on the government to government level, that doesn't always happen. So I've seen this firsthand where, it is like, come on guys, we should be able to get along. Unfortunately, there's this thing called domestic politics, and it's very valuable for, Mr. Putin to stand up against the West, or it's very valuable for a Western politician in America or Europe to stand up against those Russians. And so it helps each other get elected. But the reality is we're great friends and can get along and do amazing things like fly in space together if we put our mind to it and kind of set aside those domestic politics.
Yeah. I keep thinking of that movie. I think it was Rocky IV, where Rocky fought Ivan Drago, right? I mean, like we're probably not too different in age. So that was like, I remember the Cold War. I remember
I grew up during the Cold War.
The nuclear threats.
Yeah.
I mean, as a kid, I actually had bad dreams when I was a kid. So
the day after.
Yeah, the day after. I saw that movie. Yeah, scary.
Yeah.
But I mean, that must have been in your subconscious. But then you go over there and train with them.
Oh yeah. Well, Anton's a MiG-29 pilot. Okay. So my whole career was spent learning about the MiG-29, and Sasha Samokutyaev was a Su-24 pilot. Yeah, so I mean, yes, we knew a lot about each other before we ever met, and we had a great time, flying in space together.
What did you learn from the Russians? Because obviously you have this huge superpower like America.
Right.
They obviously have different views on space, different views on how they do things. I saw some exhibit on the Science Museum here all about the Russian program and the way they think of it. What kind of ways did you see that they thought of space different or just treated it differently?
Yeah, so they're very capable. I mean, they were the first human in Earth was Yuri Gagarin. In fact, I launched from his launch pad in Baikonur, which is amazing.
It's deep.
the same launch pad that Gary Powers flew over in a U-2, taking pictures of it. So we have this connection, 50-year connection with that space program. I do. And they are great at what they do. Their hardware tends to be simple, very robust. My favorite example is how we do water. So there's an American water system, there's a water processor, there's all these pumps and tubing, and you plug things in and dials, and it's temperature controlled, blah, blah, blah. On the Russian segment, there's a pump, and you pump it up a couple times, and you take your hose and you drink water, So there's two different ways of doing something. The American way is usually complicated. You can do more. I mean, we get more electricity, or more, there's more capability, and the Russian system is usually more simple and more robust, and so it always works. And so it's actually a great partnership to have both, because you have something that you can depend on all the time, and then you have something that has more capability. It's more risky, but it does more. So it's actually really good to have both of those together on the same spaceship.
Okay. And is that what the Soyuz is like? Is that like that robust piece of machinery?
Right. So a friend of mine one time, the Soyuz had a problem. It's basically three balls that are stuck together, and when it comes back to Earth, they separate, and the middle part is the descent module. The heat shield's there, whatever. So when they came back from space, there was a problem, and it came back backwards with the heat shield in the wrong direction. And eventually the other part just burned off and broke off, and then it's flipped around and righted itself, and they survived. They were fine. So, I mean, that's like the ultimate example of robustness, right? So it's a good characteristic to have. It may not be this gigantic space shuttle with 7 people and a robotic arm and spacewalks. It's just a simple little capsule. But that was one example where everything didn't go right and it worked, which is that's a good trait to have.
Okay. And what about just safety in general? Do they have a different way of looking at safety?
I think that speaks to their safety. They tend to they don't build things right to the very edge of the limits. They build things with a lot of margin. So if something doesn't go right, they'll still survive. Whereas the American philosophy is build it more advanced, but with less margin. So everything kind of has to go right.
Okay.
But if it does go right, you can do more things with it, right? The space shuttle is this big, capable vehicle. Soyuz is a simple little capsule. But the space shuttle also, we lost 2 of them, unfortunately, in accidents. So they're just different design philosophies.
Right. So when the U.S. thing goes wrong, it kind of goes wrong.
It goes wrong, right.
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 Interesting. Different than the overview effect, and I'm sure you've heard all those things. I mean, when you're out circling the Earth so many times and you're looking out to the rest of the universe, do you come to different conclusions than you did, say, when you were on Earth about, is there life out there?
Right.
Do you think about that? I know you're busy doing other things, but...
My whole mission was this dichotomy of the mundane and the sublime. So I'd be like, work, and then take a second, and you'd see a view that humans weren't meant to see that is just, you can't even imagine, and then get back to work, especially on my spacewalks, because you're just on the clock. I mean, it is work. And you're outside in a little spacesuit. There's like that much plastic between you and death. So you don't want to spend a lot of time out there. You want to get your stuff done. And you're usually hanging on to metal, looking at stuff. So every once in a while I would turn away. And I can remember this one specific view. There was a sunrise going, from horizon to horizon. And it was just beautiful. There's not even a word to describe it. And it was like I'm seeing God out here in space. And then I had to get back to work because there was, I had to go turn some bolts and do something. So that's kind of the astronaut's life, is this back and forth between seeing these amazing sights, and there's a lot of work to do to keep the space station running.
Do they keep you busy up there to keep you busy? Or is there really all that work to do? Or is it better not to have you idle?
So it is better to not be idle. That's when people go to Antarctica or on a sub or something. That's when you kind of go crazy if you don't have any work to do. But that's not a problem on the space station. At least there's only 3 U.S. crew members. Usually it's 2 Americans and a European or Japanese or Canadian. And on the segment, on the modules that we have, there's more than enough work for those 3 people, every day to keep them busy. But the psychological aspect is super important. In fact, you were talking about the difference between Russians and Americans. There was one day I was floating down from the Russian segment and the US segment, and the main module is node 1 where everything connects. And as I was floating through node 1, and I had been in space for a couple months in this nice, comfortable, sterile, like I said, 22 degree, 15% humidity environment, metal and plastic. It was nice. It was like a Hollywood spaceship.
Hotel room.
All this, and I heard these birds chirping, and I like stopped, and I went, that was a bird I just heard. And I looked in the node 3, and Misha Kornienko was in there exercising on our weightlifting machine, basically. And there was birds, and I started talking to him in Russian. I said, Misha, I hear a bird. And he said, yeah, listen to this. And so the Russian psychologist had sent him an MP3 of bird noises, like noises from space. And it was the coolest thing I had ever heard in my life. And so I said, well, tell them to send me some. So they emailed me some MP3 files. And at nighttime, probably for about a month, I would put my headsets on and fall asleep in my sleeping bag listening to rain, just the sound of rain from Earth. And it was so awesome. So everybody all of a sudden got all excited about birds and crickets. They're like like at nighttime when you can hear crickets, or a crowded restaurant they sent up. You could just hear glasses clanging and crowd noise. So we said, let's make it rain. So one weekend we put rain on all the laptops. The station's full of laptops. We put this rain MP3 file, and it was kind of cool for a while. And then by Sunday night, we were ready to, jump off a building. So we turned the rain off. We were like, that's enough rain. But the sounds of Earth were something that I missed. Everybody up there too seemed to enjoy that.
Do you really think we understand that psychological change that happens when you're up there and separated from Earth for so long?
There's a guy named Jack Stusser. He's the PhD who does the psychology investigation. And most astronauts keep journals. I did. And he takes our journal, and you can be completely honest with him because they never get released. And he analyzes, how people do, and he's got a great. In fact, he studied a lot of the Antarctic expeditions and submarines as kind of a precursor to long duration space flight. And we do understand a lot of the things that make people happy, a lot of things that make them unhappy, and it's really important. I mean, when you are working together and there's no escape, it's super important. That can really make a mission go wrong or right. And in fact, when I was commander, one of my goals was to like each other when we were done. When I was commander of Expedition 43, and I think our Expedition 43 crewmates are all good friends. We email each other every week, the Russians and Europeans and Americans, and so. But that's an important part of spaceflight.
How do you lead a crew like that? I mean, like if you got everyone to be friends, you must have been successful. How do you go about doing that?
So I think when you're leading any organization, you need to understand who you're leading. If you're a Army platoon sergeant and you've got a group of 18-year-olds out of high school, you tell them what time to wake up. You tell them to put their right boot on first and then put your left boot on and hold your gun and do this. You're very directive about every aspect of everything. That's on one scale. And on the other side of the scale, if you're leading astronauts who are all it's very collaborative, and it's, all right, guys, what's a better way to do this? Or here's our problem, how are we going to solve it? It's very collaborative. Until there's an emergency. We had a couple of emergency cases, and when that happens, do this, do that. You become directive, but 98% of the time it's very collaborative. And we made some good changes, I think, to the station just by saying, hey, what do you think, what ideas? And the guys I was flying with, I flew with Gennady Padalka, a Russian cosmonaut. He has the most time of any human in space, over 800 days in space. So it's not like I'm going to be up there and be Mr. I know it all. It's more like, hey, how you work together. But you kind of have to know your situation. Are you going to be directive? Are you going to be collaborative? And that's true on Earth. It's true for every facet. And I think if you come across as you know it all, people can see through you in like 2 seconds and know that that's not true. So that's kind of was my philosophy about leadership.
Someone told me that when you're up there, there's like a little bit of a delay when you talk to Earth.
Yeah.
And that can start playing a little bit of a psychological factor. Right. And that if we ever do venture out to Mars, et cetera, the longer that delay is, the more people feel isolated up there.
Yes,
Did you
absolutely.
feel that, and can you see that happening?
So the proximity, the speed of light limits you. So our signal had to go to a TDRS satellite and then back to Earth, which is tens of thousands of miles. So it's less than a second. Plus there's computer delay and, it's like maybe a second delay. So it wasn't really that bad. But once you get to the moon, you got a couple second delay, which becomes annoying. The Apollo guys got annoyed occasionally just from the delay. And once you go to Mars, you start to have minutes of delay, which means you can't have a conversation. Right. You can say a bunch of stuff and hit send, and it becomes more a text conversation or something like it was more of an email conversation. And that's, that will definitely play into things. I felt like I was close to Earth because I could talk with somebody, but when you have to email them, you're going to feel like you're not close to Earth because you're not, when you go to Mars, you're not close to Earth.
Right.
There's a reason why you feel like you're not close to Earth.
Right, because you're a Martian.
Because you're not close to Earth, right, exactly.
Right, and that can really, over time, really kind of degrade. And I heard people say that the psychology is like, I think someone who was in space said it's almost like it's us and them, almost.
Yeah, a lot of astronauts tend to, or have experienced that, us versus them, and the ground doesn't understand what we're doing. I'll tell you, our flight directors are really good at NASA. I think they've learned a lot over the years because it used to be us and them. And I did not personally feel that way. I spent a lot of effort to try and build a relationship with my flight directors, and they're the guys that run, mission control. Yeah. And they spend a lot of effort trying to understand what it's like on our side. So but you kind of have to work on that relationship, otherwise it'll really quickly degrade into us and them. If I ever had an issue like, hey, this is taking too long, or can we do this? They were very responsive and not. But over the years, astronauts and cosmonauts have often felt like they're just taskmasters. They don't realize. So, for example, something might be a really simple task, but you have to go get this stuff. So that we call it stowage. Just finding things, gathering it. Everything's floating, so you got to put it in a bag or anyway. So just gathering things and putting them away can take forever, way longer than you can imagine. And I think over time, the flight directors who understand that can have a great relationship with the crew. Or if mission control doesn't understand that, then that can degrade pretty quickly. My experience was I had a great relationship with them.
Okay. Again, back to that question I had earlier. You're looking down on the Earth. Right. You said one time you've seen colors you've never seen in your life, which is interesting. Like, I guess because us as humans, we haven't figured out how to create those colors, right?
So I remember my very first, I launched at 4 a.m. from Florida, and there was 10 things that happened during launch that were amazing sights. And then maybe 10 or 15 minutes later, we flew into the first sunrise over the North Atlantic. Maybe over the UK, it was just a few minutes later. And I saw the sunrise, and my first overwhelming impression was I've never seen that shade of blue before. It shocked me because I didn't think there were colors I hadn't seen before, but it really was. And the pictures we take are amazing, but the chip doesn't capture, it makes one blue too much and it misses the green, or the chip does not detect or sense light the way our brain does. And so I'm writing a book right now, a space photography book. It'll be out next October, and I'm titling chapters by color. Like the first chapter is white because my shuttle flight was in the wintertime. The Earth is, Canada and Russia are white. I mean, there's a lot of white. The US was white from snow. Europe was white. So that was just like, the Earth's white. It was pretty wild. Mostly snow, but some clouds. There's a chapter on water where most of the Earth is blue, because there's water everywhere. But anyway, it was interesting to get to know the Earth by color. We installed the cupola module for the first time on my shuttle flight. And I remember when I opened the windows, I opened the window shades for the first time, and that thing is just incredible because there's 7 windows and you can stick your head and be surrounded by space. Now there's window panes, so you can tell you're in a spaceship. Whereas during a spacewalk, you can't, you can push your face out and kind of be in space completely. But in the cupola, it's a similar experience. And whenever we would fly over Australia, the whole space station would become red. Just because Australia is red, the outback is red. And so when I think of Australia, I think of red. Or the Sahara is very red also. So it's just interesting to think of the different places on Earth by color, which is something I had never thought of before. I would think of, I love the food in France, or I love seeing England, or Korea was a very busy place or whatever. But now I think of it by their color, not by the cultural things.
That's interesting with the colors like that. 320,000 pictures.
Uh-huh.
You have a picture problem, I guess. Why?
Admitting it's the first step, yeah.
Why so many? Yeah, what did you see up there that really got you excited?
We could talk for an hour. So a part of the reason I took so many pictures is I did a lot of sequences or time lapse where I'd set the camera up, put it on 2 or 4 frames a second, and let it run for 5 minutes. And then you can take that sequence of pictures and make it into a little movie. In fact, our IMAX movie has a lot of that. The Beautiful Planet IMAX film, all the Earth pictures, most of the Earth pictures were taken like that, with a still camera just taken, a couple frames a second, and then in post-production they turned that into a movie. And so that led to a lot of pictures. We also got extended by a month. During my flight, before, during, and after, right in my flight time, there were 3 rocket failures in an 8-month period. The middle one was a Russian Soyuz rocket that was carrying cargo, thankfully. But when it exploded, they delayed my replacement crew because they wanted to make sure they had everything solved before they launched the next crew.
Yeah.
So my mission...
Is that tense when you hear this news?
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, we were... Of course, it was a big deal. And we didn't know we were coming back to Earth. So we spent weeks, again, leading the crew. Every day I would get everybody together. All right, what did you hear? So I just wanted all the rumors out there, and we knew that they were rumors and they weren't true, but when are we coming back? What was the problem? This went on for weeks. So anyway, I got extended.
You don't know when you're coming home.
We didn't know we were coming back to Earth. So that makes you
anxious.
Yeah, it can. But the way I looked at it was, you have to, every astronaut has to look at every flight as their last flight, because they might get another one, but so I just looked at it as, hey, this is my time in space. I'll have the rest of my life on Earth, and I'm going to just enjoy it while I'm here, and I'll have the rest of my life to go have fish and chips and at the pub and drink a pint or whatever. So I think we had a great attitude, although in the past there's been a couple other guys who got extended, and it's like, it can be tough to get extended on an deployment. So one of the reasons why I took so many pictures is I had a bonus month, and so I took more pictures during that month. Okay. But as far as the sights to see, there are so many. The problem with being an astronaut is your bucket list gets really big. Now there's all these places on Earth that I want to go visit. Having seen them, I really want to go see.
What are some of your favorite pictures?
So one of my favorite pictures is the UK. Very early in the mission, I did a time lapse from Ireland to Siberia. I mean, UK, Scandinavia, St. Petersburg, Moscow to Siberia. It was at nighttime, and you can see the northern lights, this thin green ghost. And it was a moonlit night, so with the cameras are so sensitive, you can see the clouds and the islands and the London and city lights. It's just it's a really cool picture. That was one of my favorites. I love doing sunrise and sunset, moonrise and moonset pictures. It was about day 190, and Samantha saw me taking, she's like, Terry, haven't you gotten enough sunset pictures yet? You've been doing these for 109 days. And I said, no, I still haven't gotten the perfect one. I still want to get the perfect sunrise. But every single one of those is different, because there's a thing called beta, which is the angle between us and the sun that changes. Different phases of the moon makes every moonset different. Sometimes it's just there, and all of a sudden it gets squashed and disappears into nothing. Sometimes you can see the Earth and you see the moon set below it. Sometimes it's kind of riding the horizon and goes in at a really steep angle, or shallow angle. So every one of those was different. I remember seeing Namibia. I didn't know about Namibia until I flew in space, and I looked down at these gigantic sand dunes, and I thought, man, those are some pretty big sand dunes. And then I learned that they are, in fact, pretty big sand. They're the biggest sand dunes on Earth. They're a couple thousand feet tall that you can see from space very clearly. Wow. You could see weather patterns that were very unique based on the part of the Earth you're in. The North Pacific has these things that look like hurricanes, except for their thin bands, like galaxies. They look like galaxies. It's interesting how nature repeats itself, from
Milky Way,
galaxies to hurricanes, right, to little sea creatures. They all have the same shape. They're just different scales. The Southern Ocean by Antarctica just looks bizarre. The weather patterns down there are really not like anywhere else on Earth. It looks like, I'm glad I'm not down there. That's the kind of weather that, that I would rather not be on a boat. I'd rather be in the Bahamas. The Bahamas look like the place I want to go.
Except when there's a hurricane.
Except for there's a hurricane, yeah. So we got to see hurricanes. I saw over 20 when I was in space. And they're all amazing, but there's one in particular, MySac, and it's in the IMAX movie, A Beautiful Planet. This thing was incredible. I was watching and I saw this giant eye and I floated down, guys, come here, look at this. And I brought the crew down and everyone was like, holy cow, we got all the cameras out and started taking pictures. That was an incredible, to see that giant eye was pretty awesome.
Does it look daunting?
It looks, everything looks, unearthly, or not everything, but it was amazing. Volcanoes in Kamchatka were amazing. They really do look unearthly. There's one in particular that looks like it's from Venus. It's just cracked and has this weird alien shape. They're always covered in snow there in northeastern Russia. And there's always a couple of them erupting. You see big gray plumes of smoke. That's another place I'd love to go. Most people don't ever go to Kamchatka, but having seen it from space is a place that I got a sense that I was like looking down on creation, from space, which is a pretty cool perspective.
Yeah. How do you ever replace that, knowing that you're probably not going to go up again?
Right. I was okay with it. It's funny. I had a chance to go to Harvard Business School, and I spent a semester there, and there's really cool things happening on Earth. There's cool projects. People are doing interesting work and in business and nonprofit. There's a lot of stuff that's very interesting to do on Earth. And my experience there made me realize that there's nothing like being an astronaut. It's amazing. But there's other stuff that's great too, right? It's like winning, I'm an American, winning the World Series or the Super Bowl, or for Europeans, if you win the World Cup. That would be great if you're a footballer, but you're never going to do that again. So you don't want to relive the rest of your life just reliving that one game, right? You want to have new challenges to do. So that's kind of the perspective that I have. Yeah, it was awesome being an astronaut, and I want to tell people about it, but I don't want to just live in the past. I want to have, things to look forward to in the future.
A lot of people would like to know how you became, the guy that got to go up in the space station and do all these epic things.
Right.
And, a lot of people that watch the show, are in their late teens or early 20s, and they're like, how can I become these big, important people? And I was wondering if you could tell us how you got there.
My story.
Yeah, is it something you always knew was going to happen?
Yeah, I have this great picture of me as a 2-year-old by this Saturn V rocket.
No way.
My mom was a secretary at Goddard Space Flight Center, a NASA center near Washington, and my dad was a technician there. Neither one of them had gone to college. They just worked, as a kid. As a kid, I knew I wanted to do it. When we were in space, I remember with my crew, there were 6 of us. We were having dinner together one night, and I said, guys, there's over 6 billion people on Earth, and there's 6 of us here. We're like 1 in a billion lucky. Not that we're good or whatever, we just are pretty lucky to be up here. But my personal story, I tell people don't tell themselves no. So I always knew I wanted to be an astronaut. As a teenager, my room was full of airplane pictures and space pictures, but I didn't think it was possible because no one actually gets to be an astronaut. That's a crazy dream. But I figured out what you needed to do.
Continue watching this fascinating conversation for free by clicking on the link below to visit our website, and I'll see you on the inside.
On my first space flight, it hit me. So during the daytime, you can't really see human activity. If you were that alien and you went zooming by the Earth during the day, you wouldn't really see human activity unless you look. Like you could see London during the day, but you have to look, and then you see little concrete, or you can see contrails of airplanes flying back and forth, but you have to actually look for it. At nighttime, you don't. At nighttime, it is brightly lit up, that kind of yellow-orange color of cities at night. And as I was looking at them, I realized that I wasn't looking at population, I was looking at wealth, which is a really interesting perspective.